Ready? Okay. It's
Better now than never.
exactly 3:30.
Better never than now.
No, it's not. Let's see. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It looks like it's 3:30 and we can get started. My name is Kirby Lambert. I'm with the Outreach and Interpretation Program here at the Historical Society, and thank you for joining us. As you probably know, this is part of our Montana history and 9 more easy lessons, and I think this is lesson number 7, is that?
Sure.
So I think we got 2 more coming up, so hope you can come back for those as well. We are live streaming this for people who aren't able to join us in person, and so for that reason we're going to ask you to hold your questions and comments until the end of the presentation, and I will run up here and repeat your questions so that the people out there on the internet can hear the questions as well, and plus that gives you another chance to look at me, which is really important, I know. So anyway, our speaker today is Laura Ferguson. She earned her MA in Native American Studies at Montana State University in Bozeman. Since 2010, she has worked as an instructor of Native American Studies and Native American Literature at Carroll College and Helena College, and as a writer-editor of Indian Education for All education resources, including she's done a lot of stuff for the education program here at MHS. She is a co-author of Beyond School Marms and Madams, which is a collection of biographical sketches of Montana women, and she currently works as an associate editor at Montana, the Historical Society, for Montana, the Magazine of Western History. Lauren.
Thanks, Kirby. Hello, I'm really glad that you're here today. You would think a talk on termination is going to be a very sad talk, but this is actually a hero story. It has a happy ending. So, the title of my talk is Turning Adversity into Power, Montana and American Indians Respond to Termination, 1944 to 1970. In the late 1960s and 1970s, the American public suddenly became very aware of the political activism of American Indians, largely through widely publicized events like the occupation of Alcatraz Island or the long occupation of Wounded Knee by the American Indian movement. However, the Red Power movement, as it's been called, really began back in the 1940s and 50s, when, in response to the threat of termination and a renewed push to assimilate American Indians, tribes and Indians collectively organized to defend their way of life, defend their homelands, and to protect their tribal sovereignty. In the 1950s, termination and relocation were backlash policies aimed at undermining the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, and their goal was to undermine tribal sovereignty and to dissolve tribes themselves. In response to these threats, American Indians collectively organized and achieved great political power, and Montana tribes, tribal members, and Montana's congressmen at the time are key players in this new era of political power. What makes this era, the 40s and 50s, different from earlier attempts by American Indians to collectively organize and fight for their political rights is that this is the first time they are doing it unilaterally as American citizens. That gives them access to the American political system. It means that they are all voters, and it means that they have a say in how government is run, including federal Indian policies. The successful defeat of termination in Montana and the subsequent rise of self-determination among American Indians is the result of these collaborative efforts. During this time, we'll find that there are several organizations that are formed that play key roles. One of them on the national level is the National Congress of American Indians. At the regional level, the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, and here in Montana, at the state level, is the Montana Intertribal Policy Board. So just as a quick recap, leading up to the 1940s. During the treaty era first, treaties formalized land cessions to the United States and established a relationship of paternalism and dependency that caused subsequent problems. Tribes gave up millions and millions of acres to retain the small parcels that they had. And the United States promised them certain goods and services as part of those treaty agreements. Further, executive orders and congressional acts are going to shrink those reservations into even smaller land bases, and then the allotment policy beginning in 1887 and extending up to 1933 will further erode that tribal land base as land becomes privatized, put into fee patent status, and sold. The end result of this is that on most American Indian reservations by 1940 there is widespread poverty and homelessness, and tribes as a whole have been dispossessed of the bulk of their lands. In the 1940s, the federal government says that reservations are somehow too small for the tribal population, even though the United States has been the agent that has been constantly shrinking the reservations. Tribal poverty is still pretty significant, and remind you that we're on the cusp of American economy going up at this time. Federal oversight of tribes is still very top-heavy, and paternalism continues to prevent genuine self-determination and self-sufficiency. Tribes distrust the BIA, and the federal government cannot fulfill its treaty obligations to tribes. So, just to look at where Montana's tribes and western tribes in the 1940s are, this is a photograph that was taken in Lander, Wyoming. There were similar signs put up in Billings, in Hardin, in Polson. Indians or breeds not allowed. Prohibit the sale of liquor to Indians, breeds, or minors. This is what American Indians confronted when they came home from World War II. And as you know, a disproportionately large number of American Indian men and women volunteered for World War II. Similarly, on the reservations, assimilation efforts have really undermined cultural values. A lot of Native Americans are not fluent in their native languages, if they speak them at all, aren't aware of their tribal histories, and very few, compared to earlier generations, identify with the ethnic identity of their tribes. On the Flathead Reservation, which will be the focus of our talk today, non-Indians outnumber tribal members, and I think it's about 5-1 in 1940. Also going on during this era is America's energy boom. It really starts in the 30s with the building of dams and expansion of coal, but that takes off during the 40s and then really skyrockets in the early 1950s. Oil and gas, coal, uranium, and hydroelectric power are sort of driving the American post-war economy. It's in that time that 3 new federal Indian policies are introduced. And I say new because really they're the same old policy cast in a new way. The first one, the voluntary relocation program, is introduced in 1952. It would allow Indians, it would encourage Indians to move to the cities and become assimilated with the American public at large. Then Public Law 280 is implemented, and that transfers or really allows states to assume legal jurisdiction on the reservation and erodes tribal sovereignty in that way because it says that state law will be higher than tribal law. Finally, House Concurrent Resolution 108, which I'll talk about a little bit more, it's more commonly known as termination, is introduced at this time. Relocation. This really is another form of assimilation put into the mid-20th century. The idea was we'll rescue the poor Indians from the reservations, we'll send them to cities, and there they will slowly meld into the wider American population. They'll get jobs, they'll participate in civic activities, they'll just become a part of the large American melting pot. And so what happens is that as people leave and go to the cities, it leaves a vacuum on the reservations because it's usually young people who are going to the cities, young families or young single people, and it's creating a gap between the urban population and the reservation population, which leads eventually to some loss of ethnic identity. Dylan Meyer, this fellow sitting here, was in charge of the Japanese internment camps during World War II, and he becomes the man in charge of the relocation program. Termination, which is introduced in 1944, and the law itself was based on proposed legislation by Wesley Dewart, who was a Republican representative from Montana, really gets started in 1953. And here are the basic outlines of the policy. It will end those nation-to-nation relationships between the federal government and certain specified tribes. It's not applied unilaterally across all tribes, but to specific ones that the federal government identifies as being the most advanced. It will end that trust status and end the fiduciary responsibilities that the federal government has. These are the responsibilities that were agreed to in treaties. It will force tribes to either become self-sustaining along the lines of a corporation where they manage their assets, or, and they only have 3 to 5 years, usually in one case it was 7 years to do that, or it will force them more likely to liquidate their assets and disperse the monies raised from that liquidation among their members. In that sense, it dismantles tribes as sovereign entities and paves the way for the total dispossession of American Indians. It's important that we look at who supported termination and why. The chief congressperson was Arthur Watkins, a Republican from Utah. And he was a strong proponent of termination because he said that the BIA didn't function well, which is true. But he also had a lot of obligations to Western energy corporations and the timber industry. There were American Indians who also supported termination. One of them was Dolly Akers, Montana's first American Indian legislator. And the reason why tribal members supported termination was because those who lived off the reservation, who didn't own land, who weren't ethnically tied into the reservation community and their culture, felt like those older full-bloods or more traditional Indians on the reservation were holding them back. What they wanted wasn't a life on the reservation. They wanted money, capital, so they could go forward in their lives. Western governors were strong proponents of termination. Many Western congressional delegates, some tribal members, and both the BIA and the people that said the BIA didn't work were largely in support of termination. Termination was billed as liberating the Indian. It was considered a benevolent program, or at least it was advertised as a benevolent program, that it would release Indians from dependency and paternalism and make them into full-fledged American citizens. They already are full-fledged American citizens. The real goal, though, was to make all Indians into taxpayers. It would open up natural resources for development and assimilate these, quote, minority Indians into the mainstream American society and economy, end tribalism, and promote American individualism the same way that allotment was supposed to do. And it would resolve a jurisdictional conundrum where on the reservations there was always a conflict between what law applied to crimes that might have been committed on a reservation. So the big push behind termination is the fact that in the 1950s, Western reservations in particular are being eyed as energy colonies. They have a lot of natural resources, and this is an example, probably one of the most famous photographs from the 20th century. George Gillette of the 3 affiliated tribes, the Mandan, Arikara, and Hidatsa from Port Berthold, crying as the Secretary of the Interior signs a bill to create the Garrison Dam. The Garrison Dam flooded 156,000 acres along the Missouri and North Dakota. On those acres were all the Fort Berthold farms. These are farming tribes. They're tribal capital. And all the medicinal and food plants that they accessed, and all the riparian areas where wildlife lived. So it forced them from being successful farmers to having to live up on the benchland where it was windy and dry and the farming conditions were horrible. The reason for the Garrison Dam was, according to the United States, it will create flood control and it will allow cheaper electricity for the folks downstream. Ironically, on the Fort Berthold Reservation, the price of electricity went up. So, it's important also that we remember that reservations are about a lot more than land and money. When reservation lands are threatened, tribal sovereignty is threatened, ethnic heritage is also at risk. And this, the photograph here is a Sundance Lodge being put up in 1951, I think, on the Blackfeet Reservation. There's a cultural resurgence going on in the mid-20th century, and I wanted to share this quote from Chief Earl Old Person of the Blackfeet tribe. It's important to note, in our Indian language, the only translation for termination is to wipe out or kill off. We have no Indian word for termination. Why scare us to death every year by going to Congress for money and justifying the request on the grounds that money is necessary to terminate the trust relationship of the United States to the American Indian? There are a lot of very big and very immediate responses to termination on part of tribes. In 1944, the year that the first termination bill was introduced, it didn't pass that year, but the year it was introduced, the National Congress of American Indians is formed in Denver, Colorado, and this is a photograph of some of the early participants in that effort. The main goals of the National Congress of American Indians are to protect tribal rights, to be a public policy watchdog as well as an advisor to the federal and state governments, and to foster the heritage of Indian tribes, including both their cultural heritage and their political heritage as sovereign nations. Montanans take an immediate role in the National Congress. Steve Demers and Darcy McNichol are among the founding officers. Montana's Flathead Reservation is among those tribes or reservations first marked for termination. The reason being that it has a lot of resources: timber reserves, grazing lands, mineral potential, water for irrigation, and hydroelectric dams. It's also got great farmland, and there are some pretty strong and very vocal, mostly white communities on the reservation who are saying that they back this idea of termination. Walter McDonald, who was the tribal chairman at the time, says, "We have a sacred right to be on our reservation." That kind of sums up right there the tribal point of view. Walter Morgeau, who's also on the tribal business council, says that Indians who opposed termination at the time were labeled unpatriotic. This is the McCarthy era. Here's the picture of, on the right, of Walter McDonald. Darcy McNichol, who is Cree but was a member of the Salish and Kootenai tribes, is also going to figure very prominently in the organization of American Indians to oppose termination, particularly on the Flathead, but also on other reservations. The Salish and Kootenai Tribal Council and their land clerk, Russell Gardepee, say that the impacts of termination would be far-reaching and absolutely devastating for the tribe. That the former practice of forced fee patents on land transferred huge amounts of land away from the tribe to white ownership, left a lot of people living in on other people's land and living without a way to make a living. Furthermore, that the full-bloods, who were still very traditional, and most of them quite elderly at this point, really had no way to compete on a competitive capitalistic market and to create a living for themselves. They point out, too, that Indians can't be successful farmers if they don't have access to credit. Interestingly enough, at this time, during the late 40s and early 50s, the federal government has been cutting back on its allocations for programs for American Indians. That means money for hospitals, infrastructure, and housing, and the revolving credit fund that was established in 1934. It's been cut in half. So without credit, American Indians can't be successful farmers because they can't borrow against their farm to get the right equipment that they need. And private lenders either don't want to lend to Indians or don't want to lend to somebody who doesn't have a successful farm and an established line of credit. So it's a sort of a double bind for tribes. It's also important to note out that all McDonald, McNichol, and Morgeau all point out that on the reservation, the Indians who have the most to lose are, for the most part, the elders and those who have land. The Indians who have a lot to gain from termination are those who don't really care about the cultural connection to the tribe. Many of them are living off the reservation. So there's this real factionalism going on the reservation. McNichol thinks that termination and assimilation are likely inevitable, and he says these should happen organically. They shouldn't be forced upon tribes, but if a tribe gets to a point where it's ready to sever ties with the federal government, let them have some buy-in on how that happens and when that happens. This is going to be the line that Montana Congress people are going to adopt eventually. They say let's work out the best possible scenario, and McNichol proposes a 4-point program of economic development for the reservation, and he says let's use this in case liquidation happens. Let's sort of use this as a way to steer liquidation to happen how we want. He says that tribal governing bodies should continue to manage those tribal assets, and this is a really important note. McNichol says that Indians living on the reservation who have a voting right should be involved in the decision-making process, but those tribal members who live off the reservation and don't get a vote in tribal affairs should not, largely because he's talking about the landowners needing to be the ones to decide what happens to their land. All of these people recognize that if the tribes are forced to liquidate their assets, they will not be able to compete against the big timber companies for 174,000 acres of timberland. They will not be able to compete against the Montana Power Company for Kerr Dam, that they will lose those two things, which right now are their biggest sources of income. Another really important figure that we need to talk about is Joe Gary from Idaho. He was a legislator in Idaho's legislature. He was the National Congress of American Indians president, and he was the founding president of the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. Gary is smart, he's savvy, he's diplomatic, and he knows how to organize people. So he organizes these two different groups, and he works with people like Metcalf, here, Montana's representative at the time, to persuade them to oppose termination. He said, "It is nearer to spelling disaster for us than any other legislation in our nation's history." The Montana Intertribal Policy Board, which was established in 1951, was established with the view that the federal government was trying to get out of the Indian business, as it called it, and that states were going to have to assume some of the responsibility of interacting with tribes and facilitating certain tribal programs. The Intertribal Policy Board had 2 members from each of the 7 reservations and 2 landless Indian members. One of the founding officers was Frida Beasley on the left, who's of Assiniboine from Fort Peck. She's also on the National Congress of American Indians. And the Intertribal Policy Board, the first of its kind in the nation, works kind of like a mini National Congress of American Indians to advise the state of Montana on federal Indian policies, when necessary to go and represent itself to Congress or represent Montana Indians to Congress, also to help steer the direction of the National Congress of American Indians. The person on the right is Sister Providencia, who became involved with a lot of the activities and helped promote the Intertribal Policy Board's policies. and I'll talk a little bit more about here in just a second. Who else gets involved? A lot of Montanans actually step up and voice their views one way or another on termination. The ones I'm going to focus on here are those who were very articulate against termination. The Cascade County Community Council in Great Falls was formed as a civic group formed primarily to address issues of urban Indian poverty on Hill 57 in Great Falls. And Dorothy Bond, who's the head of their Indian Affairs Committee, says that termination was a sweeping betrayal of trust and a land grab aimed at reducing tribes to greater poverty and forcing liquidation of tribal natural resource assets. The Community Council of Great Falls stays very active throughout this process, fighting for the right of the Flathead Reservation to continue to exist. Former Commissioner of Indian Affairs John Collier says it would bring nothing but misery for the states and the Indians. And Carly Malouf from what was then Montana State University, Missoula, said, who would want to buy 4,700 or 200 acres of forest lands, except a few large companies such as the Anaconda Copper Company? And he provided a very detailed sort of legal analysis of each point of the Flathead termination bill and presented that through Montana's congressman to Congress. On the left, we have Gretchen Billings of the People's Voice, a newspaper at the time that did publish quite a few articles against termination. Interestingly enough, the Montana Farmers Union weighed in and testified for Congress. They said that termination threatens the stability of Montana's agricultural industry because it will create additional poverty and landlessness, and that when that happens, the costs will be passed on to counties and states, that Indians will be discriminated against in the state. And they said, this already happens. How can you expect it to just go away overnight if the reservation's terminated? They objected that on an ethical and moral ground, saying that termination violates existing treaties, specifically the Hellgate Treaty of 1855. And they say that it will undermine Indians' efforts to be self-supporting and self-sustaining. Montana's congressional delegates also have an important role. Wesley Duart, the lone Republican, was in favor of termination, but the three Democrats, James Murray, Lee Metcalf, and Mike Mansfield, are all opposed to termination, generally speaking. Metcalf on the left, as you know, he was formerly a judge, and he says this is a huge abrogation of a treaty, and that's wrong just for that reason. We need to figure out what else could be done to improve tribal economies and to make it work for them that doesn't violate treaties. Mike Mansfield in the middle works very, very hard, as does James Murray, to make sure that American Indians from Montana have a chance to weigh in at Congress and testify on behalf of their reservation on the Flathead. For the most part, these three Democrats believe that termination could happen, and they know that the United States is really pushing for it, but they're also willing to say, if it happens, let's make sure it happens on Indians' terms, kind of the same sort of thing that the Indians themselves are saying. And Murray, who's on the Senate Interior and Insular Affairs Committee, has the most power at this time. He's the strongest advocate for American Indians in general during this era, and he actually introduces bills into Congress that are built on McNichol's four-point plan for economic development. Murray's point is, wouldn't it be easier to do a rehabilitation program where we're offering job training, farming training, timber management, hydroelectric management? Wouldn't that be an easier way to sort of uplift the Indians and help them become self-sustaining so that their income is adequate to support all their needs? Oops. A turning point is finally reached in late 1954 when the Secretary of the Interior at the time, Fred Seaton, says, "It is absolutely unthinkable to me as your Secretary of the Interior that consideration would be given to forcing upon an Indian tribe a so-called termination plan, which did not have the understanding and acceptance of a clear majority of the members affected. One of the things that Seaton is pointing out is that Watkins, who had been this big sponsor of termination, said, we don't really need their consent. We don't really need to even allow them to bring up treaties. We can just say that treaties are a moot point. And therefore, we can just ignore this whole issue of tribal sovereignty. All we need is 2 hours of consultation, and then we call the shots. That was how cut and dried Watkins was about the issue. Seaton, on the other hand, says, no, you have to have consent. You actually have to have informed consent and buy-in, and you have to take what the Indians have said and process it and say, how does that change what we view about what happens next? The Flathead Termination Bill was, in fact, defeated in Congress in 1954, and the only reason it didn't come back during that era was because Murray, who's here, this is a photo taken later, 1960, Murray, sitting on that committee still, kept refusing to bring a vote up. Watkins and others kept introducing more and more Flathead termination bills. I think there were 4, maybe 5 more that came up. And Murray just simply wouldn't let them come to a vote. That's pretty impressive, that he could wield that kind of power. 1970, Richard Nixon, president at the time, formally ends termination. And I want to share with you some of these extracts from his speech to Congress. The speech, when you read it, if you've looked at things that Walt McDonald said, the National Congress of American Indians said, Darcy McNichol said, Lee Metcalf said, James Murray said, Nixon's speech is basically a condensed version of all of those speeches. And I'll read you just this one excerpt. He says, the policy of forced termination is wrong in my judgment for a number of reasons. First, the premises on which it rests are wrong. Termination implies that the federal government has taken a trusteeship responsibility for Indian communities as an act of generosity towards a disadvantaged people, and therefore that it can discontinue this responsibility on a unilateral basis whenever it sees fit. But the unique status of American Indian tribes does not rest on any premise such as this. The special relationship between Indians and the federal government is the result instead of solemn obligations which have been entered into by the United States government. Self-determination among the Indian people can and must be encouraged without the threat of termination. This, then, must be the goal of any new national policy toward the Indian people, to strengthen the Indian's sense of autonomy without threatening his sense of community. We must assure the Indian that he can assume control of his own life without being separated involuntarily from the tribal group. And we must make it clear that Indians can become independent of federal control without being cut off from federal concern and federal support. Nixon is largely following exactly what the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration had to say on this issue, but it's interesting that this whole idea of termination continued into all the way till 1970, because in that interim time, dozens upon dozens of tribes were in fact terminated. Tribes like the Klamath in Oregon and the Menominee in Wisconsin, who are two of the most famously looked at cases, who both lost their tribal economies at that time, and it was devastating for them. So, looking at the lasting legacy of this era, the threat of termination really does push American Indians collectively and politically onto a path of self-determination. The National Congress of American Indians becomes especially influential during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. It's still in existence, still doing its good work today. NCAI members, including Walter Wetzel, Blackfeet, and Freda Beasley, Assiniboine, will help guide federal tribal relations throughout the 1960s and helped craft federal Indian policies that are actually aimed at helping Indians help themselves. During the Johnson administration, for example, the war on poverty legislation that included the Office of Economic Opportunity programs that are designed to help tribes. A lot of that was the work of the National Congress of American Indians working with the Johnson administration to put those programs in place. Programs like Head Start, the Community Action Programs, VISTA, Upward Bound, other programs that help enable tribes to be self-determining. Frida Beasley spends much of her remaining years in DC working on that. And as you can see, Walter Wetzel, this is 1963, he's giving an address with President Kennedy. They had a very good working relationship. Another, sorry, that little sound caught me off guard for a second. Another unintended consequence of the termination and relocation era was that urban Indians and those who had grown up without their culture suddenly said, maybe that matters a lot to us. Maybe there's something in there that helps us identify who we are and we can be really proud of it. So rather than facing those signs that say Indians not served, suddenly they could hold their heads up high and say, wait a minute, we can be proud to be Indians. Even if we look white, because maybe a lot of our ancestors were white, we can hold our heads up and say, we're proud to be American Indians. So there's a cultural resurgence that happens at this time, and it ties in with the political, rising political power of American Indians. And it's at this time when you see groups like the National Indian Youth Council being formed, when young people are learning about their treaties and learning about sovereignty and learning about that unique relationship between tribal nations and the federal government and advocating for it. Another thing I wanted to just share with you, because it's one of those happy, feely, good newsy kind of things, is that after the threat of termination is over, the tribes on the Flathead Reservation really do start expanding their programs and become much more self-sustaining. Lucille Otter is a big part of that. She pushes for American Indians to engage on the political level by becoming voters, and she single-handedly registers over 1,000 American Indians on the reservation to vote so that they will be engaged with the political process. She's also the driving force behind the creation of the Kicking Horse Job Corps training program, hoping that that will help American Indians gain the skills they need to get good paying jobs. And she is the mover and shaker behind the creation of the Mission Mountain Wilderness. And as you know, the Kicking Horse Job Corps Training Center, when it was first created, that was Lee Metcalf who carried the legislation on that. So they maintained really good working relationships with Montana's congressional delegation. Finally, I want to leave you with this really nice declaration of Indian purpose that came out of the 1961 Chicago Convention, when 700 Indians representing 64 different tribes met to decide, what do we want going forward? Termination was a bad idea. We need to offer something, and we need to flex our political power. So I'm going to share you some of the words from that. We, the Indian people, must be governed by high principles and laws in a democratic manner, with a right to choose our own way of life. We believe in the inherent right of all people to retain their spiritual and cultural values, and that the free exercise of these values is necessary to the normal development of any people. We believe that the history and development of America show that the Indian has been subject to duress, undue influence, unwarranted pressures, and policies which have produced uncertainty, frustration, and despair. Only when the public understands these conditions, and when the public is moved to take action towards the formulation and adoption of sound and consistent policies and programs, will these destroying factors be removed and the Indian resume his normal growth and make his maximum contribution to modern society. The right of self-government, a right which the Indians possessed before the coming of the white man, has never been extinguished. Furthermore, when our lands are taken for a declared public purpose, scattering our people and threatening our continued existence, it grieves us to be told that a money payment is the equivalent of all the things we surrender. Each remaining acre is a promise that we will still be here tomorrow. Thank you all very much. And if you have questions, Kirby will help.
Thank you, Laura. Does anybody have questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Any Native American groups in Montana today that are self-sufficient?
Are there any Native American groups in Montana today that are self-sufficient?
That's a super complicated question. Part of the relationship between the federal government and tribes is that the federal government will help to provide certain goods and services, and that's part of that bargain. But increasingly, tribes are more self-sufficient than they were in the past, as they've gained more control and less of a dictatorial relationship with the federal government, where the federal government's telling them, here's your money, this is how you have to spend it. Now tribes have more control over when that money comes, they distribute and decide how to run their programs. So I think there's a creeping incline.
Yes, sir.
There were some programs in the early 70s, as I know, in South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana, where they established some facilities and tried to train tribes to manage and operate. And some were successful and some less successful, I think. But is that part of some of this, the end of this termination program?
I think the question is, so was training part of the termination program?
Yes and no. One of the outcomes of the defeat of termination was that tribes knew they needed to make a renewed commitment, and the federal government recognized it had to make a greater commitment to establishing programs that tribes could use for rehabilitation, job training, education, things like that. And so it was not part of the termination era, but it was sort of what comes afterwards, which is the self-determination era, that I think that total fear of being terminated really inspired tribes to advocate more strongly for those types of programs. At the same time, the testimony from tribes and from folks like Murray and Mansfield and Metcalf made the federal government realize that this quick liquidation of tribes wasn't such a good idea, that they would have to reinvest and gradually turn over more and more to the tribes themselves.
Yes, sir.
Kind of a follow-up question. During the 70s and 80s, there were a number of enterprises established on reservations in Montana. There was I'm calling it a pencil factory, and another factory at Poplar that was manufacturing defense products, as I recall. And so there were a lot of contracts to produce things, and they seemed to be viable for a few years, and then they disappeared. And I wondered if do you have any knowledge about why those enterprises failed?
So the question, to summarize, during the 1970s and 80s, there were a number of contracts with tribes, to enterprises to fulfill services and products, most of which seem to have failed. And why is that?
The quick answer is I don't know that there's any one single reason why they failed. My gut hunch is that those contracts shifted to other people who could do the work more cheaply. Probably as part of it. Sometimes the product itself might have just become unimportant. I know that there are still tribes who manufacture camouflage, for example, for the military. So I know that there are probably several other types of products that are still manufactured on a contract basis with the federal government.
Well, I have a question. I believe you said several tribes were terminated.
Yes.
What happened? I mean, what's their status today?
Some of them had to tooth and nail fight their way back to be recognized as tribes, because if your tribe basically is terminated, you are no longer recognized as an American Indian, no longer eligible for certain federal things. And also, it became pretty quickly apparent in the 60s, after these termination programs had been going for a while, that the end result was pretty much exactly what Native Americans themselves had predicted. A lot of poverty, a lot of landlessness, and the quick liquidation of assets and resources. So some tribes, like the Menominees, had to actually petition Congress and prove that they were actually still a tribe and actually still needed to exist. Yeah, some of them have not been successful. There were dozens of California tribes that were terminated in groups. Each termination bill was specific to either a tribe or a set of tribes, and there were dozens in California that were terminated who are still fighting to be re-recognized as tribes. Yes, sir?
Are the intertribal policy boards still active, and what is their role today?
So are the intertribal policy boards still active, and what is their role today?
Montana's governor's office has a Indian Affairs coordinator type of person. Montana is unique in the sense it, maybe not completely unique, but it's been very much in the forefront of having a good working relationship, by and large, with our tribal governments, and they've got their tribal government representatives that they work with. The Intertribal Policy Board is not still in effect. I think it sort of morphed into the Indian Office, the Indian Advisory Office for the Governor's Office. The National Congress of American Indians is still active. The Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, which was a regional group that included the Pacific Northwest and Montana, was very much involved with fishing rights and upholding treaty rights in Washington State, and timber rights and fishing rights in Oregon and Idaho. And then they slowly kind of faded away, but a lot of the same people are involved in the National Congress of American Indians, which are still active today.
Other questions or comments?
I've got another one.
Okay.
You mentioned the fact that many American Indians at some point left the reservation and went to the cities. Did that reverse at some point? Did they come back?
Did the
sorry.
question is, so many individual Indians left the reservation and moved to the city. Did that reverse, that process reverse? Did they move back to the reservations?
Yes and no. Sorry, I don't mean to be vague on that. The exodus of American Indians to the cities has continued to grow over time, but in the last 10 and 15 years, there's been a really big push on the part of a lot of reservations to bring well-educated professionals back from the cities to the reservations to establish their businesses and trades on the reservation. We also have seen in the 1970s and 80s the growth of tribal colleges, and that was one of the things that drew a lot of these young urban professionals back to their reservation and got them more involved with affairs on the reservations.
Bonnie?
What, 75% of Flathead Reservation used to be owned by whites, and now that's going the other direction, and how's that going?
I don't know the latest, oh, sorry, your question.
Yeah, so at one point, 75% of the Flathead reservation was owned by non-Indians. What's the status of that now? Has it changed?
It is changing. I don't know the statistical updates on that. I know that during the termination era, one of the things that the tribal council said was, we better figure out how we can buy up these airship lands, the trust lands, or we're going to lose all of them. And that there has been a very concerted effort not only to buy back lands, and they've been fairly successful at that, but also to make sure that they're rehabilitating those lands, rehabilitating the Jocko River as part of that, kind of trying to bring back some of the things that were lost during a lot of heavy agricultural use. So it continues, that's all I know. Yeah.
Richard?
You mentioned earlier about who has rights over crimes or laws. It seems like recently, it sounds like the tribes have been very forceful in taking that role on. Is that so true?
Are the tribals gaining more jurisdiction rights in terms of crimes and that sort of thing?
I don't know the answer to that. I know that, of course, the Major Crimes Act applies on the reservations, and that for a while under Public Law 280, there was a big push to put states' rights over tribal rights and to enforce state laws on the reservation. But there have been hundreds of legal cases that are saying what law applies here and who has jurisdiction. I do think that, generally speaking, tribes are trying to strengthen their law and justice systems. And there are some tribes, not that I know of in Montana, but some tribes who are saying we need to enforce our own laws that are different from state laws and different from federal laws applying to different types of crimes because they need to be culturally specific and bound to who we are as a cultural people. There we have it.
Okay. Well,
Thank you
Laura,
so
thank you
much.
very much. That was great.